Hello, Yakri here with another Artifact video. Today I want to talk to you about tier lists and Artifact. Tier lists in card games in general, but I'm focusing on Artifact here, and I'm going to be giving a lot of Artifact-related examples, but much of this is generalizable to tier lists in card games and somewhat into tier lists in general, although I think card games present a somewhat unique problem. So I saw this video by the Artificers Guild earlier, and they did a tier list of heroes for the gameplay we saw at PAX specifically. And it just, I know it's filler content, but it still just kind of bugged me how meaningless it was on a few axes, right? So I think there's an inherent problem with creating a tier list for heroes in particular, and there's also an further inherent problem with creating any kind of tier list before all of the cards are released. And so it just kind of bugged me because it's just kind of not very meaningful, right? It's not a very meaningful video. So let me explain why I think this is. So first off, creating a hero tier list. Why doesn't this make a lot of sense? Well, this is in Dota 2. Heroes are not directly comparable in Artifact. They're cards, just like all the other cards. All right, not just like them. They are a different type. They have different uses, but within heroes, there are hero cards with different purposes, and they have different strengths. And it's not just that they have different strengths in the same area, they have completely different areas of strength, completely different utilities. They aren't really all comparable. And I think this is just kind of a general thing you can generalize to types of cards in card games, right? You can't compare all sorceries in standard Magic the Gathering in a meaningful way because some of them are different colors, and what color they are is going to matter. Some of them do different things. They solve different problems in different ways. And it's not really useful to compare, say, a sorcery that destroys all creatures to a sorcery that lets you filter your deck to improve your draw. In some cases, you may prefer to have the card that helps you filter your deck, and perhaps there's even an argument that it could be more powerful than the other card depending on the cost comparison, but it's not clear that one is better than the other, but rather they are circumstantial. There are places where you can draw direct comparisons, right? But you have to narrow your focus a bit more than an entire card type. For example, if we look at all sorceries that are blue, we're starting to get something a little more meaningful, but they still have different uses, and you can often use them side by side for completely different reasons. And so when you can have both of two options and they don't do the same thing, it's very strange, I suppose, to try and rank them differently in power. Instead, you could compare all cards of a type. For example, all blue cards that let you filter your deck. There's probably a best card at that in that color. There's probably a best card at doing that in general as well. Although filtering by color, I think, is helpful to add more meaning to creating a tier list, right? Because you do want to provide useful information, right? So that's why I think creating a general list of cards of some broad type, it does not make a lot of sense. And creating a tier list requires context, right? That's my other point, which is that a lot of people have been evaluating cards and creating tier lists and whatnot without general context. And general context is required to evaluate relative power. Now, you can talk about something in a vacuum, and you can say, well, in a vacuum, this seems interesting, right? And it clearly has some potential uses. There's no way to tell how powerful it will be overall, but you can discuss it in that case. However, that's not where some people are limiting themselves to. Most discussion is like that, I think, but some people go and say, like, oh, this is a very strong card. Now, if that person is in the beta and knows what all the cards are, then more power to them. They can say whatever they want because they actually have the context, right? They don't have to be right, but at least they have the correct context to make that evaluation. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so cards are also played within formats, right, and decks, and that context, not just the context of having all the cards you can compare them to relatively available, but that context is also very important, okay? So you can have cards that are individually very powerful that don't see play because they just don't fit into a deck, right? They don't have, there isn't like a great, let's try to put that. They don't have to fit in anywhere to be good in a vacuum. That's a good way to put it, I think, right? So not all cards can be played on the same metrics. Or compared, not played. Not all cards can be compared on the same metrics. That's like the really important takeaway here, and that's the biggest issue I had with their video, which is that they're comparing all heroes. I don't think you can do that and come out the other end with meaningful, useful results. So, I already talked about this a little bit, but how can you rank things in a card game? I think you can do it as many ways as you can come up with that fit this criteria that I've previously listed. 1, compare relative power and produce meaningful information, okay? So the goal of a tier list is to allow yourself or your friends or just people on the internet to take a look at it and get an idea of what the relative power of some things that compare to each other is, right? I've got a Warframe tier list that I've put up previously, so obviously this probably most people looking at this video don't play Warframe, but take this hypothetical. All Warframes, all the classes in that game are used for more or less a similar purpose. They have some niches within that, but you've got some basic goals, right? It's a looter shooter, so you go into missions and you complete the missions efficiently and get as much loot as possible, right? And so the better one of those is at completing missions efficiently and getting as much loot as possible, the higher it goes on a tier list relative to other things that aren't as good at that. So keep in mind that when you're creating a tier list for something else, something like a card game, or really anything where it's not a generic class system, because generic, like just a class, some sort of class system where you have different characters or classes, is a very easy kind of tier list. But especially if you can only have like one person playing one of them at a time. But with a card game, it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because you can't just compare all cards because they're very different and they have different purposes. So you can't compare them in a one-to-one way, okay? So that's why you might want to sort your tier list in a different way. And as long as it meets this criteria, though, of pairing relative power of things, like 2 different cards that let you filter your deck, 2 different creatures that let you deal damage to towers, or 2 different removal spells, that's a pretty direct, good example, you should be able to get some sort of idea of relative power, which will let you, in turn, produce meaningful results, right? Which removal spell should I choose if I'm playing a black deck and I need more black removal? Okay, that's a concrete question that can be answered by a tier list, assuming it's accurate. What's the next most generally powerful black removal spell that you can get access to, right? Take that one, stick it in your deck. And you know, there's more to deck building than that, but this is the purpose of the tier list. This is how you can make a tier list useful for yourself, your friends, people on the internet, presumably new players especially. Yeah, so that's that. All right, so how do we do this in a card game? It's going to be different for different games, but in a card game, I think these are the metrics, axes by which you can sort a tier list that I've come up with. If you come up with your own, more power to you. Just remember, it's got to produce meaningful results, and you need to actually compare things that are similar enough in use to be comparable. Now, I'm laying all of these out for educational purposes, but in practice, you'd really only probably use like 1, 5, 6, and 7, right? Rank decks, rank cards by use and mana cost, and rank cards by use, mana cost, and color. Possibly you could rank cards just by use, but it's often better to sort them a little bit more than that, right? And then, of course, finally, ranking cards for limited or draft is super different than ranking cards for construction, constructed formats. If you're not familiar with what those are, limited/draft is some sort of format where you build your deck and then go play with it out of a set list of cards, right? Some sort of limited list of cards rather than your full card collection. Let's go through all of these one by one. Let's talk about option 1. Ranking by decks is perhaps the most obvious way to rank things for a tier list in a card game. It's relatively easy to do, and there's often useful, like easily accessible statistical information on how decks do versus each other and in general, so you can get an idea of which ones are coming out on top most commonly, and you can create a pretty like solid ranking of decks and end up with a tier list that's actually backed by a decent amount of factual information. So that's great, but there is an inherent problem with this type of tier list. It creates a need for us to delve deeper and create some other types of tier lists. And that is that you need to already have the deck, right? And you need to go and play it, and someone needs to go play it, and you need to get statistical information on it so you can rank it. And especially in card games, you very well could come up with a new deck that is better than any of the decks currently in your tier list and completely upset your tier list. So it's a useful first glance type of resource for a new player. However, we really want something more useful for building decks than for just looking at what decks are in the meta, because coming up with new decks and modifying current meta decks is like the key thing you probably want to do if you want to get better at card games or improve your win rate in a specific tournament or in the game in general. So let's look at number 2, ranking cards by mana cost. So ranking cards by mana cost is a integral element, I think, of some types of tier lists that you can create for card games, but ranking cards by mana cost on its own is somewhat problematic, right? It does not separate cards out by purpose, and it does not separate cards out by color. So to a certain extent, if you're looking at a tier list of cards by mana cost, you're going to have to realize on your own that some of the things that are in a particular tier are in that tier for their use, but they're lumped in with other things that have different uses. And you're also going to have to pick out your colors that you want to use. For example, because you're probably not running a 4-color deck in Artifact. In most card games, you're probably not using every color available or every class, different classes. And if you're talking about Hearthstone or whatever, let me talk about why it's an important element, because you need to understand why you're pairing it up with other things when you're sorting your tier lists in these later items. So you want to play cards on a curve, sort of. Artifact changes this a little bit, but in some way that perhaps we haven't fully figured out yet, and maybe some people will figure it out better after a launch, you're going to want some kind of mana cost distribution. You don't want all low-cost cards or all high-cost cards or all medium-cost cards, probably. You want some kind of curve where you have some cards for the early game, cards for the mid-game, and cards for the late game. And so mana cost is a good way to differentiate what part of the game cards are played in, early, middle, late. And if you know that there's a hole in your deck in terms of late game power, you might look at all cards that are cost 7, cost 8, and say, all right, like what 8 cost or 7 cost cards that are considered generally good overall might fit well in my deck. Now, just doing it by mana cost is probably not limited enough to give you the most useful information, but that's why you include mana cost as a factor. Number 3 adds on to this by talking about mana cost and color. This is a little bit more meaningful because, of course, you're probably only playing like 2 colors, maybe 3 colors, so you don't need to look at whatever color you're not utilizing, right? In Artifact also, we probably want to separate out items. Obviously, they don't have a mana cost, so I haven't really dealt with that much here, but you could probably do a similar thing by gold cost, except it's not as linear as mana cost is, right? So you might need to break it into price ranges. Anyhow, color and mana cost, a little bit more useful for a new player, although it's not one of my favoritist things. I think using at least 3 axes is probably the way to go. But of course, the reason for separating cards out by color is simply no, there's actually 2 purposes to it. There's 2 purposes to it. So one is that you can tell at a glance, you can just glance at cards only that are relevant to whatever deck you're building. But the other is that cards across colors will be good at different things. This exists in Artifact, and it existed in Magic the Gathering. Let me give you a Magic the Gathering example, as I'm more familiar with that than Artifact. Beast Within is this green card, and it's a green removal spell. And it's very powerful in the sense that it can destroy most things, but it also gives your opponent a beast token. Now, in another color, you might have an easier option for destroying creatures, but that's not what green is all about. Black or perhaps red would be more adept at destroying creatures because that's their color theme. And so within a particular color, you could have a different best of some card type, right? The best damage spell in, say, red might not be the same as the best damage spell in black. And that's because these colors have different themes. And so if you aren't using red, right, it may be more relevant to you to look at what the best spells of some type at some mana cost are in black, because comparing them, their relative power to red cards, is not very meaningful when you're building a deck that doesn't have red in it. There's not really a good reason to do that when deck building. Now, there's perhaps some reason to do it from time to time if you want to take a look at, or just get a more of a grasp of what colors are good at. But anyway, that's the reason to separate out by color, because colors are good at different things, and sometimes you may need to just have the best card from a color at a mana cost at doing some particular thing, and it's not really helpful to you to know that this other color does it better, because due to some other stuff that's important to your deck concept, you're stuck with the colors you already have chosen out of any of these examples. But ranking cards by use is probably the most useful single one, because cards don't normally compare well to each other. However, if we separate them out, and I've already kind of covered this a little bit in the previous point, but if we separate out all the removal spells and compare them, there's probably a best or most efficient removal spell. Maybe there's some other cards that are like kind of tied to it because, well, you can remove 2 cards, but it's a little less powerful or a little more expensive, you know, and so they end up being similarly powerful on a different point on the curve. But you could probably create a top 3 or top 5 that's pretty much accurate for all removal spells, and any other removal spells are just not as good. And that's just true. So within heroes, for example, within heroes, we could probably create a tier list of heroes that are best at pushing lanes just by being in them. Take their base stats and their passive, and not consider any spells being used. What heroes are best at pushing lanes? There are probably some heroes that are better at it than others, and we can rank them. But what heroes are best overall? It's a little more vague. There are different purposes for different cards, so that's why I think that ranking cards like this is one of the most useful axes. It's one of the most important, actually, I guess. In general, I'd probably rank cards by use, and then add in some other factor, by use and color, by use and mana cost, by use, color, and mana cost, by use and color in draft, you know, that kind of thing. Different uses of cards, like, also become, it's like a whole different thing with draft, where like different card uses can gain value compared to others in drafts. So you could probably do some sort of meta ranking where you're like, all right, look, creatures are more valuable than improvements in general if you're playing limited. That might be true, it might not, I don't know. I suspect it is, but I haven't played the game, so who knows? Ask a beta player. So number 5, ranking cards by use and by mana cost. This is, for obvious reasons, useful. I'm going to kind of skim by some of these later points onto draft, but by use and mana cost, well, you know, if you need a removal spell and you need, or you need creature spells, rank creature spells by use and mana cost. So it's more useful to rank creature spells by both use and mana cost, because knowing what comparing creatures across mana cost is a little less useful than comparing creatures at a particular mana cost, in my opinion, for gaining useful information about what cards you might want to play, because you play cards at different mana costs at different points in the game. So this last one is kind of a big deal. All the previous points are completely different when not utilized in the context of draft, right? You need a totally different tier list for draft versus constructed, because of course in constructed you have this assurance that you can combo cards with other cards, that your cards are going to be played together, that you'll be able to reliably get most of the cards you're going to play, and so on and so forth. In draft, you don't always have a choice of which cards you get, and often you may be picking between like the least bad of many options, and other people are going to be doing the same thing. And as a consequence, games tend to be slower. You probably higher cost cards gain more value, and just different things become important. How exactly that like shakes out for Artifact is not completely clear. It doesn't have to be the same as other card games, but it's probably going to be very different than your rankings of cards in constructed, and some things will remain good across both formats and some things will not. So you have to go back through all these previous steps and re-rank things for limited formats. It's very different from constructed. So that's all I've got. This has been how to rank cards in a card game, how to create tier lists for a card game. Gosh, what can I say in summary? Well, in summary, we've got all the points I've previously mentioned, and I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that tier lists, if you want to make one at all, are supposed to be informational resources, right? The idea is that you rank things in order of their power, not because necessarily only the best things are useful, but in order to give people kind of an idea of the power hierarchy of a game. And in a card game, you have to do this in a somewhat more complicated way than in other games. So just bear that in mind if you are endeavoring to create a tier list, or in fact, if you're reading a tier list and wondering, what the fuck does any of this mean, and is this even good? A good indicator that it is actually kind of decent is if they compare, like if the person creating the tier list compares like things, and so such that the information you gain from it will be useful. Like if you want to answer a question like what is the best black removal spell, or what's the best 3-drop creature in red, or and also specifies, you know, constructed versus limited. I mean, I don't think anyone's gonna make the mistake of mixing up constructed and limited in the same group, but I feel like it's an important distinction to make for those of you who are not familiar with the fact that they're generally different, new players, you know. All right, thank you all for watching. That's all for now. Yakri out.